She walks alone, but not in defeat. She's not broken, she's becoming. In a world that tells her she needs a crowd to have value, she's learning that solitude is sacred. She's not bitter, she's building. She's not lonely, she's in alignment. This is not the absence of friendship, it's the presence of power. When no one claps, she still rises. When no one sees her, she sees herself. A woman with no friends isn't to be pitied, she's to be watched. Because when she finds her voice in silence, she becomes unstoppable. This is her awakening. This is her becoming. There's something sacred about solitude, a quiet space where the noise of the world fades and a woman is left face to face with herself. When the phone doesn't ring, when there's no one knocking at the door, when invitations stop coming and the room grows quiet, it's not emptiness she's met with, it's truth. Solitude strips away performance. There's no one to impress, no one to entertain, and no one to pretend for. In that stillness, she meets herself, sometimes for the very first time. The woman who always wore a smile for others begins to ask if she even likes the things she used to laugh at. The one who followed every trend begins to wonder what truly resonates with her soul. Without the chorus of outside voices, her own voice gets louder. Her desires, her wounds, her questions, her dreams, they all begin to rise. This is the birthplace of self-discovery. Not in the approval of friends, not in the validation of relationships, but in the raw space where she stands alone. It's in the mirror with no filters, no makeup, no performance. And in that moment, she finds clarity. She starts to unravel all the roles she played just to fit in. Roles that cost her peace, authenticity, and sometimes even joy. The absence of others becomes the presence of honesty. There's no pressure to people please or to shrink herself to make others comfortable. Instead, there's room to stretch, to breathe, to grow. She begins to remember the things that used to light her up before the world told her what she should love. Maybe it was writing, painting, dancing in the living room, long walks, or just staring at the sky. In solitude, she reconnects with the small sparks that were buried under years of noise. She no longer seeks permission to enjoy her own company. She starts to realize that peace isn't found in a crowded room. It's found in a quiet soul. And as she spends more time alone, she learns to listen, not just to herself, but to something deeper. Intuition sharpens, discernment grows. She begins to notice patterns in her past, the people she chased, the friendships she forced, the situations she tolerated. She begins to ask better questions. Why did I feel the need to be needed? Why was I afraid of being alone? What do I actually want, not what others expected of me? These questions don't come with quick answers, but they open the door to a woman who knows herself, and a woman who knows herself becomes powerful beyond measure. And Amiz Ogano is a woman who knows herself becomes powerful beyond measure. Solitude becomes her classroom, her healing ground, her place of alignment. It's not always comfortable. There are days when the silence feels heavy, when the absence of companionship aches, when the memories of being left out, betrayed, or misunderstood haunt her. But even those moments are sacred because they push her deeper. Instead of avoiding pain, she learns to hold it, to examine it, and to grow through it. She begins to see that her worth was never attached to who stayed or who left. It was always within her. She realizes she doesn't need a crowd to feel whole. Her wholeness was never missing, it was just buried beneath distractions. What once felt like loneliness transforms into presence. She becomes present with herself, her thoughts, her spirit. She starts to create boundaries, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. She no longer entertains people who drain her. She no longer silences herself for the sake of acceptance. She no longer fears being alone because solitude has taught her she's never truly alone. She's just finally in tune with herself. And that self-awareness becomes her strength. Her vision clears, her confidence deepens, and her path becomes defined, not by others, but by her own soul. Rejection often arrives uninvited, unexpected, and unwelcome. It stings, it unsettles, and for a moment, it can make a woman question everything about herself. Why wasn't I chosen? Why wasn't I enough? What did I do wrong? These questions echo in the silence after a closed door or a broken connection. But what if rejection isn't a sign of inadequacy? What if it's an intentional redirection from something not meant to carry her purpose? Rejection, though painful, is rarely final. It's a form of divine intervention that removes what doesn't serve her, even when she doesn't yet understand why. At first, it feels personal. The job she didn't get, the friendship that ended without warning, the relationship that crumbled just when she thought it was building towards something real. These moments shake her. They shake the foundation of her confidence and blur the lines of her identity. But time has a way of revealing the hidden mercy in unanswered prayers. She begins to realize that some doors stayed shut, not because she lacked value, but because they couldn't contain her calling. Some people walked away not because she was unworthy, but because their presence would have distracted her from becoming who she was born to be. Rejection forces her to pause, to reevaluate, to look inward. It exposes the parts of her that sought approval over authenticity. It confronts her with the truth that she may have been settling for less than she deserved, for environments that didn't nourish her growth, for relationships that only saw fragments of her. That no becomes a sacred redirection toward a version of life she hadn't dared to imagine. She starts to see that what she thought was failure was actually favor in disguise. In those quiet moments after rejection, she starts to tap into something deeper. The rejection becomes a filter that removes false opportunities, fake support, and fragile attachments. What remains is real. She begins to trust that if something left her life, it wasn't meant to carry her forward. If someone rejected her, it wasn't a reflection of her worth. It was a reflection of their inability to recognize her value. The pain of rejection makes her sharper, more focused, and less willing to compromise herself just to be accepted. She stops chasing places where she doesn't feel seen. She stops begging to be included. She stops overextending to prove her worth. Instead, she redirects that energy inward. She invests in her healing, in her purpose, in her vision. Every no she received becomes a push towards something greater, something with more alignment, more peace, more power. The rejection doesn't define her, it refines her. It becomes the fire that forges resilience. And then one day, she looks back and sees the pattern. That job that didn't hire her freed her for an opportunity that better matched her gifts. That friend who cut her off made space for people who genuinely love and uplift her. That man who walked away cleared the path for her to discover a love that doesn't ask her to shrink. That past that finds her to rink, finds her to spring. That past that finds her to shrink. Every closed door taught her something. Every detour had a destination, and none of it was wasted. She begins to see rejection not as a stop sign, but as a signpost, one pointing her toward purpose, elevation, and authenticity. It no longer devastates her, it develops her. She learns to bless the things that didn't work out, not with bitterness, but with gratitude, because now she knows that rejection is not the end of her story. It's the beginning of a new chapter, one she's finally ready to write on her own terms. There is a sacred power in isolation that most people overlook because it doesn't feel good at first. Isolation can feel like abandonment, like punishment, like being forgotten in a world that keeps moving without you. But for a woman on a path of becoming, isolation is not a prison, it's a process. When the noise fades, when the crowds thin, when the support system falls silent, what's left is raw truth. In that rawness, identity begins to emerge, not the version shaped by the expectations of others, but the real, unfiltered essence of who she truly is. When she's isolated, there's no one left to perform for. No more bending to fit into spaces that were never designed for her. No more shifting her tone, her style, her dreams to match someone else's comfort. In the stillness, she begins to recognize how much of her identity had been borrowed from culture, from broken relationships, from family pressures, from social media comparisons. In isolation, all of that peels away. What remains is the woman beneath the mask, the one who has been waiting to be seen, not by others, but by herself. She starts to hear her own thoughts without interruption. The opinions of the crowd no longer drown out the whispers of her soul. In that silence, she realizes how often she had allowed others to tell her who she was. She was too much for some, not enough for others. She was called emotional, dramatic, quiet, cold, selfish, or naive. Those labels no longer stick because now she's sitting with herself long enough to understand what's actually true. And as she sheds those false identities, she begins to reclaim her name, not the name others gave her, but the one she gives herself. Isolation becomes the forge where confidence is built, not the kind that comes from applause or affirmation, but the kind rooted in knowing. She starts to know what she values. She starts to know what she believes. She starts to know what she deserves. And that knowing becomes her foundation. She's no longer shaken by trends or temporary opinions. She's no longer driven by the fear of missing out or the need to be included. Her solitude becomes her sanctuary, a space where she cultivates her truth. In that space, creativity awakens. She explores her passions without judgment. She gives herself permission to try, to fail, to evolve. Her ideas are no longer filtered through the lens of acceptance. She writes, creates, prays, dreams, and rebuilds herself in the quiet. Isolation reveals her resilience. She begins to see how much strength it takes to keep going when no one is watching, how much courage it takes to heal without an audience, how much power lives in the woman who chooses to rise with no hand reaching down to pull her up. The woman who comes out of isolation is not the same as the one who entered it. She is sharper, wiser, clearer. She no longer seeks to be everything to everyone. She no longer sacrifices her identity for proximity. She learns to be whole without needing to be surrounded. And because she's been alone, she knows herself. She knows what peace feels like. She knows the sound of her intuition. She knows how to return to center when life gets loud again. Others may not understand the transformation that took place in the dark, but she doesn't need them to. She doesn't need validation when she already has vision. The time she spent in isolation wasn't wasted. It was sacred. It was where she remembered who she is. It was where she stopped living to be liked and started living to be aligned. Silence, often misunderstood as emptiness or weakness, is actually a sacred space where strength is born. In a world that glorifies constant noise, instant replies, and the pressure to always speak, a woman who embraces silence begins to tap into something deeper, something steady and unshakable. When she stops filling the air with explanations, justifications, or apologies, she starts to hear something far more powerful, her own inner voice. Not the one layered in doubt or conditioned by others' opinions, but the voice that carries wisdom, clarity, and calm authority. In silence, there is space to think, to feel, and to discern. It is in this stillness that she starts to observe her reactions, her emotions, and her thoughts without judgment. She no longer reacts out of habit or fear. Instead, she learns to pause, to breathe, to respond with intention, or sometimes not respond at all. And in that pause lies her power. She begins to understand that not everything demands her energy, her words, or her presence. Some things are best met with silence because silence is a boundary in itself. It says, I see you, but I will not shrink for you. I hear you, but I choose peace over chaos. This silence isn't passive, it's active. It's a quiet resistance against being pulled into drama, noise, or the need to prove herself. It's a decision to rise above the superficial and go inward. She starts to notice how the world tries to keep her distracted, constantly entertained, constantly connected. But the woman who is comfortable in silence is the woman who cannot be easily manipulated. She cannot be easily swayed. She cannot be easily swayed. Her mind is focused and her emotions are grounded. Silence becomes her shield. In moments of conflict or betrayal, she learns that responding in anger doesn't restore her dignity. Remaining silent often protects it. When others misunderstand her or speak against her, she doesn't rush to defend herself. She knows the truth, and more importantly, she knows herself. Silence, then, becomes a sign of maturity, not weakness. It reflects the strength of someone who doesn't need to fight every battle, especially not ones that drain her spirit. In that space of quiet, her inner world expands. Her thoughts become more organized, her vision becomes clearer, and her goals more defined. She begins to dream again, not shallow dreams based on approval or popularity, but rooted dreams based on purpose and alignment. The noise of others' expectations no longer clouds her path. Purpose and excellence no longer clouds her path. She starts to feel guided by something internal, something divine, something steady and true. That guidance is her intuition, and it grows louder the quieter she becomes. Through silence, she also heals. Not every wound needs to be talked through. Some just need time, space, and stillness. When the world gets quiet, she finally hears the parts of herself she had been ignoring. The part of her that was tired, the part of her that needed rest, the part of her that craved peace. In that silence, she gives herself permission to feel without the pressure to explain those feelings to anyone else. That emotional honesty becomes a well of strength. She is no longer running from herself. She is facing herself, embracing herself, and nurturing her power from within. Over time, silence becomes her sacred practice, a place she returns to again and again to recharge, realign, and remember. It's not a punishment, it's a gift. A secret garden where she cultivates confidence, wisdom, and grace. Others may not understand how she keeps her composure, how she moves with calm authority, how she navigates storms without making noise. But she knows. She knows the power she's built in the quiet, and that power, rooted in silence, cannot be taken, shaken, or silenced.